The signs of worm infection in sheep often go unnoticed until the problem becomes severe. By that time, producers frequently experience significant unseen losses in productivity. Gastrointestinal nematodes live in the abomasum, or the fourth stomach, and the intestines, and cause sickness and death, as well as reducing appetite, feed intake and productivity. Young stock and pregnant animals are most at risk. This is due to their weaker immune systems and low resilience to the worms. Appetite and feed intake can be affected significantly, more than 10% up to 20%, even when the animal has a low worm burden. Knowing your worm infection level and administering the appropriate treatment reduces this loss and prevents further worm egg contamination at paddocks, which of course will lead to further worm problems. Faecal egg counts are essential in determining the level of adult internal parasite burden and providing valuable information to influence the drenching decision. Faecal egg counts are a practical and accurate tool to estimate the burden of adult worms in monitored animals, or to check the overall worm status of a mob or a group to decide if a therapeutic treatment is necessary, that is, a treatment that will directly benefit the animals treated. Faecal egg counts are certainly much more accurate than visual assessment and will identify an emerging problem long before any visual signs appear, at which time significant production loss will already be occurring. The ideal timing to conduct a faecal egg count depends on the individual situation, but working on the following can help you decide. Do a faecal egg count 7 to 10 days prior to a planned activity, such as joining or weaning. Do one 30 days after a seasonal break. That allows time for the worm eggs to hatch on the pasture, infect the sheep, and be detectable in a faecal egg count. Monitoring during high risk periods is recommended because livestock in high condition score can also have a high worm infestation that's causing production losses and can rapidly escalate, resulting in poor health. To check the effectiveness of a drench, conducting a faecal egg count on the day of treatment and again 14 days after drenching will determine the drench's efficacy and inform you of any emerging resistance to those active ingredients. Long-acting drench best practice should require a 30, 60 and 90-day faecal egg count to monitor for resistant worms and determine your requirements for an exit, clearance or tail cutter drench. According to the MLA in 2015, internal parasites cost the Australian sheep industry over $430 million. That's $6,000 per 1,000 sheep. The most important worms in Australia are barber's pole worm, also known as Haemonchus contortus. This worm lives in the abomasum. It likes warm, moist conditions, so it's very common in northern areas, but it's increasingly seen in southern regions, especially in times of summer rainfall. It sucks blood and causes anemia and death. Female worms lay 5 to 10,000 eggs per day. The brown stomach worm, also known as Telodosargia circumcincta. This worm lives in the abomasum as well. It copes well with cooler environmental conditions, so it's common in the southern regions. Females lay about 100 eggs per day. These worms severely depress the sheep's appetite. Black scour worms, also known as Trichostrongylus. There's several species of this worm common in Australia. They live either in the abomasum or the small intestine. They cause black scours and they're common right across temperate and northern Australia. Females lay 100 to 200 eggs per day. The number of worms in the sheep's stomach and intestines is strongly correlated with the number of eggs seen in the faeces. Therefore, counting the eggs in dung samples is a simple and non-invasive way of monitoring worm burdens in sheep. The higher the number of samples taken, the better indication of the worm burden in the whole mob. Studies have shown that 15 samples will usually correctly reflect the status of a mob of 200 head, but accuracy decreases as mob size increases. You should have a collection tray provided by the company who's undertaking the fecal egg count, or for a temporary solution, plastic bags can be adequate until you have your sampling kit. One method of collecting the fecal matter is directly from the rectum of the individual animal. Alternatively, the samples can be obtained by picking them up off the ground after holding the flock for around 15 minutes in a corner or from the yards. Ensure the fecal sample is clean from foreign material, it's fresh, less than 10 minutes old, so it should still be warm, and each sample is from a unique animal. It's important that the sampling kit is correctly sealed and all paperwork is filled out correctly. You need to send the fecal samples off to the laboratory as quickly as possible. If short-term storage is required, place the sealed samples in a cool place, not the fridge, away from light and for no longer than 48 hours. Once the samples are received by the laboratory, you should have the fecal egg count report back to you within 24 to 48 hours. The level of worm eggs counted will determine the risk of production losses and/or death. As well as the number of eggs, you should also know the species of worm. This requires a larval culture. When you receive your fecal egg count test result, you'll see a variation in the egg count between different animals in the same flock. This can be due to their different health statuses. An animal with an illness will have an overtaxed immune system and be more vulnerable to internal and external parasites. The age of the animal, so younger animals are more susceptible to worms. Towards the end of joining, rams are more susceptible to worms. Pregnant and lactating animals will likely have higher worm burdens, and this will be exacerbated by multiple young. And each individual animal genetically has a different tolerance to worms, and so they all have different fecal egg count levels. Most of the significant worm species have eggs that appear almost exactly identical during a worm egg count, so a larval culture is required to identify the species present in the sample. This adds a lot of further value to the test result. You need a minimum of about 100 eggs per gram to undertake a reliable larval culture. A mixed worm infection is more severe, as well as being more common than a monoculture of a single worm species. Larval culture involves incubating the worm eggs in the lab for 7 days under specific conditions of temperature and humidity to allow the larvae to hatch and develop to the third stage, that is L3. These larvae are then stained and examined under a microscope to work out the species of worms present. Species can also be determined by doing a polymerase chain reaction test, also known as PCR. From this accurate data of the overall worm egg numbers, the variation of the worm egg numbers between individuals, and the identification of the worm species present, a reliable drench solution can be recommended by your animal health consultant. One of the primary pillars of a high-performing flock is to limit the productivity and financial impact of the intestinal worms. To be able to make an informed decision on drenching your sheep, it's vital to have the accurate data of a fecal egg count and larval culture. Thank you very much for watching. I trust you found this informative. If you have any questions, please visit Livestock Solutions on the Zoetis website for further information.